Okay, good day everyone, and welcome back to our Zowe Quarterly Update webinar series. I am Rose Sekach, Zowe Onboarding Squad Lead, and today I'm joined by Adam Wolfe, Squad Lead for both Zowe CLI and the Zowe Client SDK. Adam is also a co-squad lead for the Zowe Explorer for VS Code. And taking your questions in the background, we have Billie Jean Simmons, who is a co-squad lead for the Zowe Explorer for VS Code, and Timothy Johnson, who's a member of Zowe CLI and the Zowe Explorer for VS Code squad. So lots of Zowe expertise on the line. And this quarter, we are going to be featuring team config for the Zowe clients. Last quarter, if you missed it, we were focused on a project called Event Management. Now, Adam, if you could advance to the next slide, this just to give you some background, every quarter we bring together experts from the Zowe community. We present a focused topic and we take some questions on the topic, and then we follow up with some news and upcoming events. And I realized that I didn't change this quarter's topic. It should read team config for Zowe clients. Before I hand it off to Adam, though, I've got a couple of, first, a slide on an upcoming release events that we want to make you aware of. First and foremost, anyone still running Zowe V1, please be aware that support ends for all of the Zowe V1 components this year on September 30th. That is community support, as well as likely all of the vendors who are comprehensive support providers for Zowe. Please do check with your vendor to confirm that. But as far as we know, that support terminates on that date. And to make you aware of some other activities, the new release date for V3 is September 30th. So that at the same time that V1 is terminating support, we will be introducing V3. There will be a few more active releases scheduled for Zowe V2, the final one being delivered at the end of August. That means that Zowe V2 will be transitioning into maintenance, only receiving fixes and security patches. We expect that the first maintenance release to be delivered in early January. And then, of course, V2 will remain on support for several years. Okay, and then just before I hand it over to Adam, just a few housekeeping items. Attendee microphones are muted, so please, if you have any questions as Adam goes through the content, we highly advise you type them in the chat or the Q&A. We've got folks monitoring that, as we mentioned. The webinar will be recorded for replay and will be available at the OMP YouTube channel. Look for the Zowe Quarterly Update playlist. If we run out of time and we are not able to respond to your questions, we will follow up with responses as soon as we can. And we'll do that via the Zowe Help channel at OMP Slack. And if we have access to your email address, we'll reach out to you in that manner as well. Okay, so I think that's it for me. Over to you, Adam, in our focus topic.
Okay, thank you, Rose. So hello, everyone. Today I'll be talking about team config, which is important if you're using Zowe CLI or Zowe Explorer. It's effectively how you configure those applications to connect to services on the mainframe. So we'll start with a brief overview of the role that profiles or configuration plays in terms of Zowe CLI and Zowe Explorer. I'll touch on changes to client-side Zowe configuration that are coming in V3, as well as how to quickly convert from V1 profiles to a team config. And then I'll do a deep dive into the structure of a team config file, and also cover how to build and modify them to suit your needs. And the last thing I'll go over are some more advanced capabilities within Team Config that can be very useful for certain users if you have a more complex environment. Um, so, having said all that, let's begin with some background on what Zowe CLI and Zowe Explorer do with profiles. So, to understand Team Config, you need to understand how Zowe CLI and Zowe Explorer work. Zowe CLI and Zowe Explorer interact with services running on the mainframe. In most cases, these are REST services, but by default, we support ZOSMF, ESO, and SSH, which is not a REST service. But of course, you need to install. You can install Zowe CLI plugins or Zowe Explorer extensions to support other services as well that you might need. And in order to access these services, Zowe CLI needs to know a few things to create the connection. These include the host address that points to the system you're connecting to. We also need to know the port number for the service running on the mainframe. And then we need to send some form of credentials to authenticate to the service, which could be user and password, could be token, could be certificates. And finally, services that you connect to will typically have additional user settings. For example, with TSO, if you're running TSO commands in Zowe CLI or Zowe Explorer, you will have to provide an account number and a logon procedure. So it is possible to pass all of this information as command line options, like in this example where I'm listing datasets on an imaginary mainframe. However, storing this information in a configuration file so that Zowe CLI and Zowe Explorer can load it automatically is much more practical for most users. Um, the one exception there might be if you're running Zowe CLI and some kind of automation, where it might make sense to pass these options because you're not typing them in. However, uh, in the past, this information was stored in what we called V1 profiles. And with the release of Zowe V2, we implemented a new configuration format called Team Config, TEAM config. But before we talk about Team Config, let's talk about V1 profiles, which I will also mention will not be supported in V3. So when we talk about V1 profiles, we're referring to profiles created using the Zowe profiles create commands in Zowe CLI, and there are also ways to create these profiles in Zowe Explorer. And V1 profiles are stored as YAML files, with each service having its own directory of profiles. So you could have multiple ZOSMF profiles as multiple YAML files in the profiles/ZOSMF directory. And I have an example of a V1 ZOSMF profile on the right. As you can see, you have host, port, user, and password are stored securely. Reject unauthorized is set to false, and what that means is that effectively allows you to use self-signed certificates for this connection, and then the protocol is HTTPS. In terms of benefits for V1 profiles, what makes them still somewhat appealing is that it is easy for users to get up and running with V1 profiles. For example, if all you need to do is connect to one instance of ZOSMF, you can run the Zowe profiles create ZOSMF profile command in Zowe CLI, give it a host address port and your credentials, and you're ready to go. However, managing credentials for multiple connections can be tedious with V1 profiles requiring users to either update their secured credentials for each service manually or use a base profile, which would alleviate some of the pain there unless you want to connect to multiple systems with different credentials, different host addresses, and so on. It's also a bit more challenging to roll out V1 profiles to members of an organization. Of course, you could send a zip file of the profiles directory or put the profiles directory in a repository somewhere, but you still have to worry about maybe overwriting profiles when you pull down updates to your local machine. Or you could maybe have people put the profiles in the wrong place on your hard drive, and you lose default profile settings and so on. So the V1 profiles worked. Um, they were effective, but they do have some shortcomings, which team config was introduced to resolve. And so when we talk about V2 configuration or team config, we're talking about the same thing. We just typically call them team config because that's a shorter name, I suppose. But users can create a team config using the Zowe config init command in Zowe CLI. You can do something similar in Zowe Explorer for VS Code as well. The team config file is generally named zoe.config.json and typically lives in the .zoe folder in the user's home directory. Now, in theory, a user could change the Zowe home directory, or they could also create what we call project configs that exist in other directories. And we'll talk a bit about that in the future. But the gist here is team config. If you have a zoe.config.json, you are running team config. And on the right here, you can see I have an example of a basic team config with a single ZOSMF profile. You'll notice the format is different because it's JSON rather than YAML. And I'll go into the structure of the team config file a bit more in future slides. But regarding the challenges with deploying V1 profiles at scale and on more complex use cases, team config solves these challenges by being a single, easy-to-share file. You can have connections to any number of LPARs or sysplexes within a single team config, and you can send the team config to everyone on your team and have everybody up and running more or less immediately once they update their secure credentials. There are also benefits from how team config is structured. It allows users to use nesting within the JSON to organize profiles that share common properties, like host name and credentials are common ones that are shared among different services. And this can be very useful when working with connections to multiple systems. And it also simplifies credential management, reducing the amount of manual work to update passwords. And so why is the topic of team config so important right now? Well, in V3, V1 profiles will not be supported. So if you want to upgrade Zowe CLI or Zowe Explorer to V3, it'll require that you implement a team config to access mainframe services. And we've decided to discontinue V1 profiles for a few reasons, but most significantly, in our experience, most users are not using V1 profiles anymore. Team config is easier to deploy. It might take a little bit more work to build a team config, but once a team config is in place, they're easier to maintain and they're much more flexible than V1 profiles. Additionally, from the engineering and support standpoint, continuing to support V1 profiles does put additional burden on support and development for what might be seen as possibly an obsolete configuration method. So the question then is, what should you do if you're still running the V1 profiles in Zowe CLI or Zowe Explorer? I think the fastest way to get from V1 profiles to a team config is to use the profile conversion methods that are available in Zowe CLI and Zowe Explorer for VS Code. And in Zowe CLI, we have the Zowe config convert profiles command. And in Zowe Explorer V3, we'll give the users the option to convert their V1 profiles to a team config if we detect that they have V1 profiles. And the other alternative is to build a team config from scratch, which is what. So, team config. I'll start with the basics. Some of this might be something you're already familiar with if you're a team config aficionado, but I think it's important to cover the basics, and we'll talk about the structure, and just give you a few pointers on what you're looking at when you're dealing with the team config. So probably the most important thing about team config is that it is a JSON file. And a good way to think of JSON syntax is that everything is effectively a key value pair, where a value can be several things, including a string. As you can see for the host address, it could be a number, like port, where 443, you can see, is not in quotation marks. A value could be an array. And you can see we have the secure array that is a list of strings. A value could also be another JSON object. You can see this in the defaults or the profiles, for example, in this sample here. We have the defaults. That is a JSON object containing one property. The key is ZOSMF. The value is also ZOSMF. And finally, you could also have a Boolean value, like we have the auto store setting at the bottom of the example there. And so a few other points on JSON property names and string values are enclosed in quotation marks. Arrays are enclosed in square brackets. And JSON objects are enclosed in curly brackets. And everything is separated by commas. And it's also important that you have the curly brackets at the beginning and end of the file. And so that's a quick rundown of JSON and how it relates to the team config. But let's dive into a bit more of the specifics here. So when you look at a team config, you can break it down into several sections. I call them top level properties here, but we're really looking at the leftmost items in the config. So starting at the top, you have the schema, which is a special field that you should not modify. This file is used, well, the file that the schema path points to is used by your editor when modifying the team config for listing valid entries for a given field. This is really useful in VS Code. We'll talk about that later. Next, you have the profiles. And profiles is a JSON object that contains all of your service and base profiles. And I'll cover exactly what that means in the next few slides. But here you can see that we have a single profile called ZOSMF. Then we have the defaults, which is a JSON object that lists the default profile used for each service. In this case, the default ZOSMF profile is also named ZOSMF. Maybe I should have named that profile differently to make that a bit clearer, but that's what's happening there. And then finally, you have the auto store setting, which is a Boolean value, and that tells Zowe CLI whether it should automatically store connection properties that the user enters when Zowe CLI prompts for them. So that's a broad overview of the top-level properties in team config. And let's talk a bit more about the structure of profiles. So effectively, the same information is here that was in V1 profiles. It's just organized a bit differently, and it's all in one file, one for each connection. So in team config, you store all of your profiles within the JSON object, the top-level JSON object. And I'll go over the diagram here. So quite simply, you have your top-level profiles property here. And within that, you list all of your profiles. And I just have a single profile here. It's a ZOSMF profile. So we have the profile name at the top here, and then open the curly brackets. And within this JSON object, you define a type for the profile. In this case, it's ZOSMF. You could have a type of TSO, SSH, ZFTP, KICS, depending on whatever plugins you might have installed. And the next item within the ZOSMF profile is the properties. Now, the properties JSON object contains all of your connection settings that you store in plain text. And That's important when we talk about secure. But within properties, you'll have things like host, port, reject unauthorized, um, uh, protocol, certain things like that, anything specific to the connection to the service you're connecting to. And below that, we have the secure array. It's not a JSON object, it's just an array. And within the secure array, you can list properties that you want to store securely. I think the most typical use for the secure array is to put all of your credentials in the secure array. That way, Zowe CLI will prompt for them when you run the Zowe config secure command. And that will store whatever properties you have in here in your operating system secure storage facilities. Now, normally people just put credentials in here, but you could, in theory, also put host or port or some other property in here and secure that field if you don't want that information to be stored in plain text in your team config. And I think that about covers the basics of how the profile is structured. One thing also to note is that the order of these items does not matter. You could have the secure array as the first thing here, and then type, and then properties. You could rearrange this completely. Um, this, this is the way I think it is created by default by the Zowe config init command. And moving on to talk about service profiles in a bit more depth here. So when we say service profiles, a service profile is a profile that stores connection information specific to a given service. In the example on the right, you can see we have a ZOSMF profile, a TSO profile, and an SSH profile. And I apologize if that font is too small to read, but it's a vertical file and it doesn't really translate too well to PowerPoint, but I think you can get the idea. So in service profiles, you store all of your connection information. It's also worth noting here that service profiles can inherit the properties of the default base profile. And the base profile is kind of a special kind of profile. I'll talk a bit more about it on the next slide. But when I say that service profiles can inherit properties from the default base profile, I mean that properties specified in the base profile are propagated to the service profiles in the team config. So if you happen to have the same property specified in a service profile that is also specified in a base profile, the entry in the service profile will override the property from the base profile for that service connection. And in case that was confusing, let me talk a bit more about base profiles to kind of, I don't know, cement that information. So when we talk about base profiles are a kind of a convenient option for storing properties that are common to multiple service profiles in your team config. I think the most common use case for the base profile is to specify a host address as well as credentials, because those are typically shared among the multiple services that you might be connecting to, assuming you're connecting to a single LPAR. If you're connecting to multiple LPARs or multiple systems with different host IDs or host names, addresses, there are other ways to do this. But if you just have one LPAR you're connecting to, a base address, and kind of reduce the amount of duplication that you have in your profile. And I think that covers base profiles pretty good depth. It also is worth noting that if you specify your credentials in the base profile, you only have to update those credentials once, and that credential will be used then for all of your service profiles in that config, which is convenient. But moving on, I touched on this a little bit in terms of the secure array, but we talked about service profiles and we talked about base profiles. Let's focus in briefly again on the secure values that are provided in the team config. So team config allows users to specify properties securely using the secure storage facilities of the user's operating system. And on Windows, we use the Windows Credential Manager. On Mac OS, we use the Mac OS Keychain. And on Linux systems, we use the GNOME Keyring. Again, the fields listed in the secure array are stored and recalled using these facilities. And secure values can be updated using the Zowe config secure command in Zowe CLI, or you can also use the Manage Profiles menu in Zowe Explorer to update passwords, or also to get a new token if you're going through the API mediation layer. It's also worth noting you can store other profile properties by including them in the secure array. Again, if you didn't want host to be stored in plain text in the config file, you could put it in the secure array, and you would be prompted for it when you run Zowe config secure. And I think we've covered profiles. Well, we've covered the secure array. So you know what it is in terms of the structure and kind of the basic concept behind team config. Let's go over the process of actually building a team config from scratch. So the first step to creating a team config, and this can also be done in Zowe Explorer, but I kind of focused on Zowe CLI here, is to run the Zowe CLI command, Zowe config init, and I would also recommend you using the --DC option, which creates a kind of a bare bones, what we call a global team config, and the GC option stands for global config, and that puts a team config in your .zoe folder or your Zowe CLI home folder, and that config is accessible anytime you run a Zowe CLI command, regardless of your current working directory if you're in a terminal, or if you have a workspace open in Zowe Explorer or VS Code. But when you run this command, it creates a bare bones global team config. You can think of it kind of as a template, and I've included the output of this command on the right side of the screen. The Zowe config init command also creates service profiles based on the CLI plugins that you have installed. So if you have the Zowe CLI Kicks plugin installed, you would also see a Kicks service profile here. And again, we can note the structure of the config, the schema up at the top. You have your profiles JSON object, and within that you have a ZOSMF, TSO, SSH, and base profile. You also have your defaults, JSON object, and autostore set to true. I believe that is the default. Pretty sure. I would say I'm 100%. That is the default. So moving on to customization. So for this demonstration, I'll assume that we're only connecting to a single LPAR or a single system at a single host address. I'll talk about how to build a team config for multiple systems in a later slide. But so here we are, we've run the Zowe config init command. We're looking at this team config. What do I do now? So fundamentally, you'd go through each profile and update properties to accommodate your environment. As an example here, I might first look at the ZOSMF profile. Is port 443 correct? Maybe we have the ZOSMF REST service on a different port. You would go in and change that port number to whatever makes sense on your system. And then you look at the TSO profile. If you're not running TSO commands in Zowe CLI or Zowe Explorer, you could probably ignore this profile. But if you are running TSO commands, you'll want to provide an account number. You want to double check the code page and also check the logon procedure. Moving down to SSH again, really here, you would check the port. There are a few other properties you might want to consider, but by default, all you have is port. And in base, you would want to make sure you have the right host address for your system. And if you're using self-signed certificates, you would also want to modify the reject unauthorized um, setting here. And that's really the gist of it. When you're starting from Zowe config init, you would also want to run Zowe config secure dash dash gc to update the secure properties stored in your global config. So when working with team config, we generally recommend using an editor like VS Code, Visual Studio Code, which provides JSON syntax highlighting as well as dynamic lists of available properties via IntelliSense. I'm sure there are other editors that provide similar functionality, but this is what we use, and we also like Zowe. We also like VS Code just because it has Zowe Explorer as well. And you can see as I'm typing in properties here, all I have to do is um, enter a quotation mark, and it gives me a list of available properties for the profile I'm working on. And here I just chose to specify a host import, but you could see all of the available properties. And this makes it much easier to modify a team config when you have access to the IntelliSense provided by Microsoft VS Code. You can also modify them in other editors. If you know exactly what you want to update, maybe you're just changing a port number or changing a name in a profile, you could use any editor really. It's not a big deal. But I find in my own practice that having these lists of available properties is massively helpful. So that's the basics. Now, uh, there are a few more advanced topics I want to cover here. And I think these are very helpful, um, particularly if you find the template created by Zowe config init be insufficient for your particular setup. And the first thing I'll talk about here is profile nesting. So when I talk about profile nesting, we mean having a profile defined within another profile that inherits the properties of the profiles defined above it. You can think of it like a nested logic structure in programming where you might have a loop inside of another loop. In this case, you have a profile inside of another profile. And before I move on, I will, in all fairness, I know that font is microscopic. In the next slide, I have kind of zoomed in sections so you can take a closer look at what I'm doing here. But so nesting can take place of a base profile in certain ways, while giving you more control over the service profiles that inherit the specific properties. This is useful when you're interacting with services on multiple LPARs or different systems, different sysplexes, because it lets you define credentials on a per system basis. And it lets you specify settings that apply to all services on a system without applying those settings to all service profiles in the config, which is what would happen if you were using a base profile. On the next slide, I'll dive a bit deeper into this example. So here we have a sample nested team config with a few sections zoomed in. In this case, I have an internal development system that I use for just general development work, and I also have a system that I use for performing demos. Um, and on these systems, I have different credentials. We go to different hosts. Uh, if I was using a base profile, I would have to do some, well, in fact, in this case, you wouldn't be able to use a base profile because the hosts are different, the credentials are different. Really, nesting is the answer for this use case. But if I go from the top of the config, you can see the top level profiles object. And within that, I have a dev profile and I have a demo profile. And within the dev profile, I set my host. I provide a secure array containing user and password because I want these credentials to be separate from my demo profile. And then I list the service profiles that exist on under this dev profile. So I have ZOSMF, I have an SSH profile. They all use these secure credentials and they all go to the dev system. Similarly, you can see for the demo system, I have a different host. I have my secure array that's separate from the dev secure array, so I can update those credentials separately. And then I have another pair of service profiles for ZOSMF and SSH. So it's also important to note here, as you nest profiles, you can nest these as many levels deep as you want. I think in most cases, you'll just do one level of nesting. You'll have your LPAR, then you'll have your services running on that LPAR. But you could maybe go sysplex, then LPAR, then your services. Really, team config is very flexible in that regard. But as you go deeper, it's important to note how the way that you reference these service profiles changes. Effectively, the name that you use to interact with these profiles. In this example, you can see that we're not calling just ZOSMF, we're calling dev ZOSMF profiles. My default profile here for ZOSMF I have set to dev.zosmf, and you get that from the name of this profile dev, and then the name of the profile below it that connects to the service, which is ZOSMF. And then I have dev.ssh. If I had multiple levels, maybe I had I don't know, system1.dev.ssh. If you had another level of nesting, you just add another period between the different profile names. So that's nesting in a nutshell. And that shows you how to build the team config in a way that implements profile nesting. But you'll also need to know how to use these nested profiles. So when you have a nested team config, Zowe CLI will use the default profile specified in the default section of the team config, unless you specify otherwise. So users can specify which profile to use for a given Zowe CLI command using the dash dash, in this case, ZOSMF dash profile option, and then providing the name of the profile to connect to. In this case, it would be, I guess, demo.zosmf. For other kinds of service profiles, there are similar options. You could have a dash dash SSH dash profile option, and then you give your SSH profile name. That works for should be any service that you nest if you want to contact a different service running on a different LPAR. Other than what you have specified as default, you would have to specify this option manually on any command that you run that goes to the service. In this case, is ZOSMF. In Zowe Explorer, however, it's a bit nicer, I think. Users can add any number of profiles from their config to the datasets, USS files, and jobs tree. As you can see on the right, I can see both ZOSMF profiles in one window in Zowe Explorer, which is fantastic. And to add a profile tree in Zowe Explorer, you click on the plus sign above one of the trees, and you'll be presented with a kind of a drop-down list that shows the available profiles from your team config. And that covers nesting. And the last topic here is around global project team and user configs. And I don't want to overwhelm you with this information, but it could be useful to you at some point. So it's also worth just laying this out. So we call v2 configs team configs, I guess colloquially. But in some ways, that can be a bit of a misnomer. A config can apply globally, or it can apply on a per project basis. And I'll tell you what that means shortly. You can also create a user config as opposed to a team config. But let me break this down a bit. So when we talk about global configs or project configs, a global config is one that is used anytime you run a Zowe CLI command, regardless of your current working directory in your terminal. Whereas if you run a Zowe CLI command in a project in a directory that contains a project config, that project config can add profiles, place profiles from the global config. So I think what most users are familiar with is a global team config, and that file exists in the .zowe home directory, um, and that applies anywhere you run Zowe CLI, or it applies to any workspace you might open in VS Code. If you have a project config, that is a config file, a Zowe config.json file that exists in a directory outside of the Zowe CLI home directory. And to use that project config, you have to set the current working directory of your terminal to the directory that contains that project config, or you can open a VS Code workspace that contains the project config file. And verbally, this might be a bit confusing, but you can think of these additional config files as ways of either overriding the settings in a global team config, or you can think of them as adding additional profiles to a team config. Um, and again, team versus user. So effectively, the difference between a team config file and a user config file, we're talking about v2 Zowe client configuration, is that a team config is named zoe.config.json and a user config is named zoe.config.user.json. And so a user config works very similarly to how a project config works. A user config is an additional configuration file that can override or it can override profiles specified in a team config, or it can also add additional profiles that are not specified in a team config. Now, let me give you some context here for why you might want to do this. So, like at the most basic uh, description here, if you have a global team config, but you want to override the profiles in that config or add other profiles without modifying your global team config, um, these are a couple options that you can use to do that. And an example of where you might want to do this is if you regularly, maybe you pull updates from a repository that contains a Zowe config.json. Maybe you, I don't know, maybe you have some automation that always gets the latest team config from some repository somewhere. And you pull down that file and it goes to your .zowe home directory, and that's always your global team config. But maybe you're also working on some other projects. Maybe you connect to some different systems or some different services. You would still subscribe to that global team config that you get from, I don't know, an administrator or somebody on your team, but you want to also have your own connection specified to services running on the mainframe. Maybe you want to run with some different settings than you would use in the global team config. Configs give you that option to create additional profiles that aren't in your team config without risking having your maybe your custom profiles overridden whenever you pull down an update to your global team config. And I think that's the best way to sum that up uh, without overwhelming you with the details. I have added this slide here, and it kind of dives into the nitty-gritty technical details. Um, I won't read it off, but it is worth noting. And I think in most cases, users might not have any need to do this. In many cases, I think from what I've seen, users have one Zowe config.json in their Zowe CLI home directory, and that's good enough. But in the event that it's not, just be aware that project configs and user configs are also an option. Maybe give you some more flexibility without having to modify your global team config. And with that, I think that's everything I had on team config. I can hand it back to Rose. I guess I should also pause and say if you have any questions, be sure to enter those in the chat, and we can hopefully answer them, or at the very least get back to you at some point in time.
Yeah, we
Okay,
did have
thank-
one question in the chat. I don't know if we want to answer it now, related to profile nesting.
I think we're good on time, so
Yep.
yeah, let's do it.
Yeah, I can read the question. In profile nesting, the properties and secure attributes work as base profile for that profile that's inside of the parent profile. I think the question is basically like, is the behavior of the properties and secure in a parent profile when doing nesting, like does that behave the same as a base profile would? And I think the answer to that, LHS is kind of like the alternative to a base profile in that nested scenario.
Yes, I agree with that.
And just to
Thanks,
add a bit
Timothy.
to that, sorry, um, like one of the benefits of using nesting is if you have multiple systems that you want to connect to, because you can only have, well, you can have multiple base profiles, but you can only have one default base profile. And so if you want to easily be able to connect to like groups of services across multiple LPARs, it may be like inconvenient then to have to switch back and forth between two different base profiles that would contain properties like the such as the host name for each LPAR. And in that case, that's an example of where nesting may be a preferable approach, since you'd be able to set up all of the profiles in a single config file and not have to change the default profile back and forth. Sorry, back to you, Rose.
No worries. Thank you, Timothy. Adam, can you hear me okay?
Yep, loud and clear.
Okay. One more point I wanted to make before we go on to the new to you and upcoming events information is, you know, in addition to the advantages that you pointed out with team config, something else that we realized early on with the Zowe clients was that having to understand producing connection information, having to learn that, having to gain access to information that seemingly developers and other possible, you know, scripters don't have common access to, was overly burdensome for every single user in an organization. And so one of the main points of team config is to centralize the management and implementation of that connection information to take that burden off of every single user in the organization. So if you think about taking the learning curve as well as the implementation of a profile out of the hands of hundreds and putting it in the hands of, you know, 2 or a handful of admins responsible for creating this, you can imagine the time savings and the frustration that's saved with every organization that adopts Zowe. So thank you, Adam. That was a very interesting topic. I hope you all found it helpful. Let's go on to a couple of just few slides to wrap things up and give everybody information on what's happening in the Zowe community. So, yep, if you go on to the next slide. Okay, what in the world am I trying to tell you here? So I wanted to give you all a picture of what's happening with the overarching picture with respect to Zowe releases. If we look to the left, the current scenario is that we have 2 releases that are supported at the moment. We have the active V2 release, and those releases are in the charts that have the green heading. We started way back in 2022. We are now in May of 2024. We just released 2.16. We are planning 2 more active releases for V2 before we transition V2 over to maintenance mode, which again, as we mentioned earlier, that means the V2 release becomes the stable release for those of you who do not want to be on a continuous delivery release. The release only receives maintenance fixes and vulnerability patches. And again, the first planned maintenance release, if you shift over to the right, down to the bottom, the blue box for V2 maintenance indicates that that release is scheduled for early January of next year. That's not to say that if a vulnerability is discovered, we don't put out an earlier release for the maintenance release of version 2. Okay, again, back to the left, the version 1 releases continue. We have maintenance and vulnerability patches that have been ongoing since May of 2022. Those will terminate at the end of September, as we've reiterated. And then jumping over to the right, V3 will be introduced the target date, with a caveat that planned release dates are always subject to change, but the target is at the end of September this year. So please plan accordingly, understand what your organization prefers. If you are in an organization that wants to receive enhancements and new capabilities, plan to be on V3. Okay, if you could advance, please. All right, so we do a lot of blogging in the Zowe community, and we're always looking for ways to bring all of our consumers information related to Zowe, but beyond what's documented in our Zowe docs. So we bring forward examples of use cases and real life scenarios in the form of blogs. So for example, depending upon what you're interested in, if you want to learn more about personal access tokens and their use with Zowe CLI, we have a blog for that. If you're interested in single sign-on, multi-factor authentication in relation to what additional value the API mediation layer brings, we have a blog for that. For team config, Jean just released a nice blog that will supplement what you just learned from Adam in learning how to write a script to create your Zowe client configuration or your team config. And there are more blogs, plenty of more blogs out there. Go ahead and search on a topic of interest. We also just introduced categories of blogs. So if you go to medium.com/Zowe, right up at the top, you'll see various components, almost like tabs, and you can click on those tabs and just narrow down your search, for example, into blogs related to Zowe Explorer for VS Code or Zowe API mediation layer, etc. Also, I wanted to note that there are many ways for you to communicate with us, but there's only one way for us to communicate back to you in reality, and that's our user mailing list. I'll talk in a second on how you can subscribe to that mailing list so that we can reach out to you and make you aware of webinars such as these and any other information that we feel as though is important, such as whether or not a release is going to be delayed. But we do recommend going to our Slack channels and notice that we have reworked some of them. We now have a Zowe help channel, for example, as well as a Zowe announcements channel. And for those of you who are looking for something specific, don't know where to go, always reach out to the Zowe onboarding channel. We're there to help point you in the right direction should you not know which one might be appropriate. And next slide, Adam. Okay, also new to us, maybe not new to you, but something that you might want to consider. We are now on a platform called Discord. This is, I think, new for System Z folks. And I think it was started maybe a few years ago by some System Z enthusiasts, as the space says. We have our own Zowe channel down under, it's kind of hard to read, but there's a ZOS section, and then there's a hashtag general. We now have a hashtag Zowe area where you can post questions related to Zowe. And the nice thing about Discord is that it brings together anyone interested on the mainframe, and in particular, those who may have more information or less information on Zowe, wider scope. And unlike Slack, the information, as far as we know, remains out there. We do know that some of you, for example, may have restrictions within your organization and may not be able to join. We understand that. Hopefully, you will be able to reach out to us via the Slack channel, and all of that, any of that being a burden. If you go to the next slide, I think we have, nope, not yet. One more slide, advance the slide.
Yeah,
beyond this one. Oh, no, okay. Okay, it's not in there. I do want to mention that many of the SMEs from the Zowe community will be at the upcoming Share Conference in Kansas City. We also frequent the conferences, the similar conferences, the GSE conferences throughout the world. But if you're interested in Zowe, please do look for the Zowe track at the upcoming Share Conference. Highly recommend that. Okay, this slide is good. Also, for your information, anyone interested in learning about what's coming with V3, whether you're an extender and you're preparing your Zowe CLI or Zowe Explorer for VS Code extension, or perhaps you want to ensure that your APIs are Zowe conformant, please plan to attend our office hours sessions dedicated to Zowe V3. We'll talk about anything ranging from features that are coming, breaking changes that you may have to be on the alert for, any changes to the conformance program from an extender perspective. We did start to run these, and we have some recorded sessions from early January. That was when they were focused on the release being introduced in March. And although some of that information still remains relevant, some of it needs to be refreshed. And so we decided that we're going to rerun the entire office hours series in preparation for the V3 introduction at the end of September. The series starts the first Friday in September, 8 a.m. Sorry, it's so early for those of you on the East Coast, and even earlier on the West Coast. But they are recorded. They will be posted at zowe.org on the vNext page. And if you're interested in attending, there's information here on how you can navigate to our community calendar from zowe.org. Zowe.org, click on the community tab, page down, you'll see the calendar. As an alternative, I have included a link here if you want to go directly to that link. And then finally, I think the next slide, just to reiterate, there is a free online Zowe Foundations course available from Interskill. For those of you who have folks within your organization that are completely new to Zowe, don't understand what Zowe is, what Zowe does, what are all the components that make up Zowe, some basic, general, very high level, not deep, but very general high level installation information highly recommend you check out this course from InterSkill. It gives you the basics, and it will help you and anyone within your organization feel more comfortable in talking about Zowe and probably moving forward with a level of installation on Zowe. And I think one more slide. We run these quarterly updates, you guessed it, every quarter, and they're not set in stone. We usually have a general guideline on where we're going to do them again, and it all depends on what's going on in the community and when it makes sense. But tentatively right now, we're planning our next quarterly update webinar in September, and then we'll look towards January and April. Certainly, if you have any recommendations for topics, we welcome those ideas. And please do consider joining our mailing list, and we'll send out the details and registration information. We'll send them right out to you. How do you join our mailing list? Go to zowe.org. There's an announcements tab right at the top, and a little arrow with a drop down and a link right in there to join our mailing list. So please do consider doing that. And if you missed this live and you're interested in watching some, either this one again or other replays of prior Zowe quarterly updates, we have a link to our OMP YouTube playlist. And with that, I thank you all for joining. I thank all of our speakers and panelists and folks on the line answering questions. Have a great day, everybody. See you next quarter.